thank the honourable member for Batman. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Chifley.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. It's often accepted as a statement of fact in the worlds of politics and the media that trade is undeniably a good thing. People will say that it's very important that we embrace freer trade, more open trade, and they'll tell us how important it is. But it's one thing to say something's important, it's another thing to actually prove it, because people feel the impact of this debate in different ways in the community, and I don't necessarily think there's unanimous agreement that trade of itself, or freer trade of itself, is people aren't necessarily accepting that it's just something that is undeniably good for them. They experience it in different ways and have for many years. And at any rate, in some parts of the country, and having grown up in a working-class family, especially as the son of a metal worker, the whole issue of freer trade has been one that's been pretty contentious. People have had to, though, in the course of the 80s and the 70s, I'd imagine, I think it's fair to say, have gone through the booms and busts. We used to have situations where periods where people were out of work for long stints, digging into their own family savings, probably only having one breadwinner in the place bringing in the income, then seeing the economy take off again, getting the jobs, travelling far to conduct that or do those jobs themselves, only to wait for another 18 months, 2 years, maybe 3 years before things went back to the usual cycle of a bust. So we've seen that happen. And as a teenager I saw what Prime Ministers Hawke and Treasurer Keating were doing in trying to change the way that we undertook trade in this country, saying that trade liberalisation and opening up the country would be important. And it is. It is important in a market where we've got now 25 million people. Being able to find more people interested in our goods and services is an economic priority. Being able to make that happen is important. But having said that, as people were going through the process of opening up our economy to provide for freer trade, they were understandably concerned, and you certainly saw that again. I'll come back to the case of metal workers, that would wonder, were they competing against others who are doing the same job for less? And that is a big concern to people. And they wonder, is this sustainable? Will I lose pay because I'm competing against someone who's working half my rate, doing the same sort of work that may not necessarily in their minds be the same quality? These are the type of arguments you have to confront when it comes to the whole issue of trade. But you'd also see, as that process opened up, Australians here working through their companies with other companies in other parts of the world on joint ventures where people would be performing jobs or parts of work where they would contribute their part in a joint venture to team up with another company operating out of maybe in our region, being able to do that work and seeing economic value reach out across borders. You've seen export markets open up where local firms employing local people have been able to supply jobs internationally or products internationally that has seen them sustain those firms, those jobs, a lot longer. And I guess the question is it any coincidence that when you look back at over 25 years plus of constant economic growth in this country, was it a fluke? No. There are a lot of changes that had to be made, and one of the ingredients to that was trade. It is no accident that we've had the stretch of economic success that we've had. There have been some big decisions that have had to be made, decisions that people have questioned, decisions that people have wondered, are they worth it? But the reality has been that they've seen things change, and for the better. Trade reform has been a big part of that. So while I myself am pro-trade, I'm not necessarily pro the way that these agreements have been done in the past, and even up to the point of this agreement, which has been why, in particular, the Shadow Trade Minister and the type of ideas that he spelled out to this chamber earlier today, captured in the second reading amendment that he's put forward, are really important. Because, as I said, you might think it's important that we, as a nation of 25 million people, have a way to trade our products on the international stage in a much freer way, we need to do the way that those things are underpinned through these agreements and the way those agreements get reached. That system has got to change. And we've been saying a number of things do need to happen. In particular, with a lot of these agreements, they land in this place, and what happens is you have very little chance to be able to change the outcome. The negotiation has gone on for a considerable period of time. No one knows the framework in which those negotiations took place. No one knows what priorities were placed within the negotiations. No one knows what we said would be the things that we would stand by no matter what, or the things we would be prepared to negotiate on. And by the point at which you get to here in this chamber, it is a take-it-or-leave-it proposition where little room is given to actually move on the agreement. And in this agreement that we're talking about today, in terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there are a number of things in here that people would have deep concerns about. The ability, for example, for the first time for firms from Canada to be able to use investor-state dispute settlement provisions to extract an outcome against Australian firms through this agreement would concern a lot of people. A lot of people in the Labor side of politics are completely opposed to ISDS provisions and have been saying that these should be weeded out. In this agreement, it's been opened up to Canada. The other element of this that we've got deep concerns about in relation to labour market testing, the ability of 6 countries now to be able to send in workers to— you know what? You're big on freedom of speech, except when someone else has a different view.
Order. The member for Chifley has the call.
Thank you. The issue of labour market testing and the ability of countries now, 6 countries, to bring in people instead of testing whether or not a local worker is able to perform that job is of deep concern. And again, Member for Kennedy, people constantly have to listen to you in silence. I don't need you yammering while I'm making the contribution. Thank you.
Order. 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 The member for Kennedy will take it. Order. The member for Kennedy will take his seat. The member for Chifley has the call and will be heard in silence.
Thank you. So the point that I make is this: in other parts of the world, those countries do stand up for local workers being able to get the ability to perform that work. In November, for example, in a visit that I did to Singapore, the Singaporeans, under their free trade agreements that they've struck, make sure that local Singaporeans have the chance, and they have systems set up to ensure that before local workers are overlooked, that they're actually given the chance to, 1, know the jobs there, 2, to apply, and 3, to also train up those workers to meet the need of international firms that are operating in Singapore. This is not something that is radical or different to what is happening in other parts of the planet. I mean, it should be something that happens here. This government's been quite prepared to wave away labour market standards as it applies to the protection of local Australian jobs. And we've said this is something of deep concern to us, and we have been saying we need to ensure that this changes into the future. These are the type of things, these elements in the agreement that we have said need to be changed. We've said that the parliament should be updated, and the public, after each round of negotiations on trade agreements, is what we're arguing in our second reading amendment, that you commission economic modelling for all new free trade agreements. This is important because it's one thing, as I said earlier in my contribution, to say trade's good. It's another thing to actually prove it. We've been saying for ages international economic modelling should underpin these agreements. It hasn't been done for this. As the Shadow Trade Minister indicated in his contribution earlier today, there's only been a few places where this agreement has been tested, including through the Victorian state government, that has tested the agreement and said that on balance it does that no sector should lose out, and has been able to provide some evidence about this agreement. But it shouldn't be left to individual state governments to do this. This should be part and parcel of any trade agreement that is being put forward to the nation's parliament, but importantly to the Australian community, so that their confidence in trade can be increased rather than having the constant questions about whether or not free trade is fair trade. So economic modelling is a condition, very important. We do need to see the type of things that he outlined, for example, establishing a system of accredited trade advisors, drawing in from business unions and the civil sector, who can provide much more real-time feedback on what trade agreements are actually looking to shape up, or what they're likely to have an impact on, and be able to deal with those things early on. To have an independent national interest assessment be conducted with every new trade agreement, and to strengthen the role of Parliament in trade negotiations themselves. And instead of having our parliamentary committees look at these things after the agreement has been done and dusted, and we get to a point where you're told pretty much take it or leave it, and you don't have scope to influence the agreement, having them involved a lot sooner is much more important. I think for too long we've just accepted that that's the way things should be done, and yet in other parts of the world, in their parliaments, they have been prepared to take a much bigger stand on being told through the course of negotiations what's being done, what's being pressed for in terms of the national interest, and then testing how the national interest has actually been served through trade agreements. This is the stuff that has to change, and it has certainly been the opposition that has put forward, I would say, one of the most far-reaching reforms to the way we do trade agreements, because, again, it is one thing to say that trade is good, it is another thing to actually prove the benefits. We do need to see that change. Otherwise, we will see more and more in the public debate and the political debate the fringe groups that get up and always, as is often the case, work off fear and anxiety to get people worked up about the way things are working, to build up their political capital, to build up their political strength and gain a voice on the floor of Parliament, because they've managed to spook the heck out of people making claims about trade that don't necessarily stack up to the evidence. The only way to deal with that is to have the proof, to take people along with us, and to be able to say it's in the national interest and demonstrate that it actually is in the national interest, instead of seeing people potentially ripped off or believe that they're being ripped off. I might make this point too. Trade has been a very difficult issue for our side of politics, and it has for many years. But when we on our side of politics were going through these reforms in the 80s and 90s, we never took the position that said we can't do this because our base doesn't support it. We argued the case, it was in the national interest, and it was the job of parliamentarians to actually go out and argue the case and win people over through that. The contrast on the other side of politics is interesting, and their example of this is on the issue of climate change, where they have argued that on issues relating to that they can't possibly see certain things be done because their base wouldn't cop it. And if you want any further proof of that, look at the member for Warringah's book Battle Lines, where he goes through his regional tour and hears the comments of Liberal Party members about the issue of climate change, and the weather vane on climate change himself changes his position numerous times, but in the end lands on a position not because it's in the national interest, but because it's in the political interest. The contrast couldn't be clearer. We certainly were aware of how sensitive this issue was, especially for working-class families, but needed to be able to put in place measures to help people on the way through, but recognise that as a result of those changes, we've seen nearly over a quarter of a century of economic growth come through, in part because we changed the way we did business with the rest of the world. This stuff is important longer term. You can either have the type of consolation that the member for Kennedy will reach out for, to give you the short-term comfort that doesn't do the longer-term interest of the country any good, or you can be fair dinkum about saying, yeah, this change is going to have impact on the way through. People do need to be looked after. We can do things better, and we can get a better outcome as a result of it. The type of things, as I said, fringe groups that you'll see in this place that will try and go and spook the heck out of people don't sustain us longer term, and should not be the ones that we should necessarily lean or gravitate towards, but ultimately be able to be realistic about what people's concerns are, deal with them and make sure the country is better off in the long term as a result of it.
I thank the honourable member for Chifley. The question now is that the amendment be